Okay, can someone just let me know if they can see my slides full screen?
Perfect, Tom. Perfect.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Right, without further ado, so thank you for inviting me this morning. As Michelle said, I work at Birkbeck, University of London. I have a background in academic libraries and in open access publishing. And I'll tell you a bit more about the COPIM project that got mentioned there. I work on one specific work package to do with open access book funding models, or about which lots more. I should point out as well, a colleague of mine who I work with very closely, Kira Hopkins, is on the call. They're going to be dropping some links in the chat. So if it looks like links are magically appearing, that's because they are. So this morning I want to talk to you all about open access for books, what that means in terms of books versus other open publications like journals, why I think open access for books is vital, particularly so right now, and then a little bit on how various groups of communities, scholars, publishers, libraries, how they're making it happen. And I need to start with two apologies. The first is, I'm sorry if my talk takes a somewhat UK-centric path. That's the context in which I'm working, which I understand most. But what is happening in the UK is perhaps likely to be replicated elsewhere. So I believe it's still applicable and of interest, I hope. And my second apology is that I will, by accident, use the words monograph and book interchangeably. But what we're talking today is about academic scholarly books. So let's just quickly start at the beginning, just so we're all clear. What do we mean by open access? As ever, Professor Martin Eve has a good definition on screen here. For books, this is no different to open access journals. Books are still the main research output of arts, humanities, and many social science scholars. I've heard monographs described as a bit like a scientific researcher's laboratory. Universities and funders know that scientists need a lab and lab equipment to produce and test their results, sometimes over many years. And if you think of the academic book as the humanities or arts scholars lab, then you can more easily picture that it too requires lots of support to make it happen. Books don't materialize out of thin air. The book and the process of writing it are kind of like the lab research and testing space. The book needs time to be researched, time to write. It needs refining and editing, reviewing, typesetting, publishing in electronic formats, publishing in printed formats, publicizing, archiving, preserving. You get the picture. All of that takes labor and expertise, time and money. And traditionally, a lot of those activities have been underwritten by selling the finished books to university libraries. Which brings me to the why. Why do we need OA for books? Well, there are several reasons. And one is that those traditional sales of humanities and social science academic books are declining. And yet we're still working as a sector in much the same way that we always have, largely based on what was originally a print paradigm. So the scholarly publishing world is changing again, and open access is now a factor of those changes for books, whether we like it or not. It's particularly a factor, I think, when the work produced has been publicly funded and the labour involved in writing and reviewing has been given willingly by scholars. A question often asked by libraries and OA advocates is, should commercial entities be making huge profits off the back of the scholarly research and communication process? So another reason why the time is right for OA books is that the possibilities for global dissemination and increased citation when publishing openly are just huge. There's loads of articles and reports on all of this, but I like to refer people to a really good short summary on the LSE Impact blog by Mitu Lucraft. Links to that at the end of the slides, and hopefully Kira might be dropping them in too. Essentially, Mitu points out how much more widely books are read when they're OA. And of course, remember that COVID exposed how vital open access could be to the future of scholarly commons when everyone's locked out of their library buildings. At the same time, that pandemic put library budgets under even more pressure than ever as well. And then, if you add into all of this mix, we're now seeing a number of policies and mandates appearing around OA for books too. Links again at the end of my slides, but today we have OA book policies from funders in the Netherlands, Austria, Norway, Ireland, and Portugal. The Council of the EU has said that for publicly funded research, open access should be the norm for monographs as well as for articles. And over in the UK, we've got the new UKRI policy that went live this time last year with an open access requirement for research funded by them. So we've got carrots and we've got sticks in the arguments for OA for books. All of which brings me somewhere to the how we might make it happen. Well, one of the biggest challenges is the economics of it all. How do we pay for this transition to open access for books in such a way that is fair and sustainable for both libraries and for publishers? And also, how do we maintain what we call this sort of bibliodiversity in a move to OA? The scholarly publishing landscape is a very varied one, comprising large and small players, commercial and non-profit, publishing embedded within the university and publishing external to the university. So flipping to OA for books would present different challenges to these different parts of the sector. And that's particularly the case when funding is inequitably distributed, with some universities filing substantial deficits and others resting on significant endowments. As of today, I believe 80 UK universities have open redundancy schemes of one kind or another. Colleagues are being laid off left, right, and centre, and the brunt of course closures is, of course, being felt in arts, humanities, and social science departments. So, at a time like this, when many AHSS departments are under threat of closure, it seems to me that OA for books could be one of the strongest tools these departments have for proving their relevance and their reach and their impact. Why lock up research in an ivory tower? Why make years of your work inaccessible to the majority of interested readers, sold in declining numbers and for high cover prices? And alongside that, libraries are having their budgets cut to the bone too. It's a really challenging time for HE and for open access funding, but it seems to me this is something we should be still focusing on. So that's the big picture, the wider context of all this. I'm going to drill down to a few details of how we might finance moving from selling books traditionally to making them openly accessible. And one way we could do that is to look to the journal world, where many people on this call will know a lot about. Open access has been a thing for much longer, and where there are quite a few mature and embedded models for publishing articles openly. You'll hear people talking about green, gold, and diamond OA. When I was running through my slides, I realized I just don't have time to go into the definitions of all of these. So I've put some text on here to brain splurge. I'm happy, of course, to talk afterwards. And of course, Anne talked about a green route on their repository just now. But I'm going to shortcut and say that over in the journal world, the most embedded and the most dominant model for funding the production of open articles is the author pays model, sometimes known as the APC, full name, Article Processing Charge. But unfortunately, this method of paying for open access articles, one at a time, privileges funded researchers, wealthy institutions, and established academics on permanent contracts. And when we try to apply the same model to books, as indeed many publishers do, it gets much worse because books cost so much more to produce than an article. We call those one-off author fees book processing charges, or BPCs. And not only do they also favour wealthy institutions, but they also concentrate costs on specific research projects. That's not good value for money, and it doesn't sustain the press as a whole or the underlying infrastructure of running a press. It's just paying for one book at a time, and that one book's costs. It doesn't scale. So in removing barriers to readers, the BPC instead erects a barrier to authors. And I like this slide, which articulates the problem we face here. It's a choice between charging the author to read or charging the publisher, charging the author to publish or charging the reader to read. So my point is that funding a transition to OA books using per book charges alone is financially impossible. They can be useful sometimes, actually, but that's for the Q&A, I guess. But more often than not, humanities researchers just don't have access to the money needed for a €10,000 BPC. Who's got that lying around? Departments don't have it. Libraries usually don't have it. They might have enough for one. So we need other revenue models to work alongside them. And we need libraries to actively engage with these other models so that we don't end up with 5 mega publishers hoovering up nearly all the available money, as has happened in the journal world. In a move to OA for books, and particularly if those big commercial presses hoover up the money, there's a real risk to the bibliodiversity I mentioned earlier, that a risk that the smaller, the scholar-led, the mission-led and university presses get squeezed out. And ironically, in that sense, that big stick of mandates and policies, that could backfire, because in trying to push the sector more quickly towards open access, a mandate saying you must publish openly could inadvertently make life very difficult for smaller publishers if they don't have a funding mechanism of their own. I'm going to take a small detour into what kind of money we're talking about here. The money is eye-watering. There is definitely money in the scholarly publishing ecosystem, but perhaps it's being distributed inequitably. And remember too that if those big five publishers on screen now, if they have private shareholders, then a ton of that money, some of it public money, some of it you might even say indirectly student fees, it's exiting the academic ecosystem forever and going into someone's bank account. There's a comparison on screen demonstrating the relative profitability of journal publishing, but please understand, I mean no disrespect to colleagues working for those publishers. It's the system that is broken. So I hear you ask, we clearly need more equitable ways of funding away for books. So what alternatives exist? Several of the big players have models now. JSTOR runs a model, bringing together loads of presses. MIT Press have their own model. Michigan University Press have a good one. Taylor and Francis and Bloomsbury have one. Many of them, by the way, are standing on the shoulders of presses like Punctum Books in the States and Open Book Publishers and the Open Library of the Humanities in the UK. And we could talk all day about these. But I want to finish by talking about the ones that my colleagues and I on the COPIM project are working on. So we're funded by Arcadia and Research England for another year or so. We're composed of librarians, scholars, infrastructure providers, and publishers based in the UK, Europe, and the US. And we're working on different aspects of a community approaches to making open access work for books. So, for example, my colleagues on the Open Book Collective have developed a website and a platform where libraries can find OA presses. And using the site, libraries can take out annual subscriptions that, combined with subscriptions from other libraries, will fund those presses to produce new open books. The OBC right now has got something like 14 publishers on the site, some of which are university presses, more to come. They've got infrastructure providers, including our clever open metadata colleagues at TOTE, that's that THOH on screen. So the OBC also is a registered charity, so they're not going to be bought out. They're community governed and community funded. You'll see also on the slide that the TOTE work package, which is an open metadata service working to solve the problems of visibility of OA books and emphasizing the importance of open infrastructure underpinning open research practices. You know, we've got to ensure that they cannot be bought out and enclosed by commercial entities, and TOTE can't be. My own bit of the project is the Opening the Future revenue model in the middle there. And if you'll permit me, this is a quick plug, not just a plug, but it's a quick example of a new approach to the economic problem I outlined earlier. So Opening the Future is a mechanism that can be employed by any small publisher. Essentially, it's a library subscription or membership to a specially priced package of closed books from the publisher's backlist. But the clever bit is that the library retains ownership of those books after 3 years membership, and the press uses that membership money to only produce new open access frontlist books. So it's kind of a lever. Libraries get something tangible for their money, enhancing their local catalogue, and the press gets to gradually flip to OA. A couple of quick slides demonstrating how the economics of that look in reality. I think this slide speaks for itself. With the subscription to a model like this, a library can get 50 books in perpetuity for under €1,000 a year. Look at that compared to paying for one single BPC. And then this slide is even more self-explanatory, I think. I'm highlighting this because this and some of the other models out there are real functioning programs that show that open access for books doesn't mean the death of the humanities and social sciences. Quite the opposite. And to bring my bit of the talk to a conclusion, I'll just say it would be naive to pretend that collective models are the only answer to everything, but then also BPCs are not the only answer either. What my colleagues and I on COPIM are saying is that these collective models do work and they are examples of another way of doing things. Some of the presses on the OBC, like Punctum and OBP, who I mentioned, they've been going for over 10 years using collective funding. They work, they're equitable all round, and we have to start somewhere. I urge libraries to try and sustain these kind of presses in the fields that we value. Otherwise, we're going to see a situation where the sciences are fully open, but arts, humanities, and social sciences remain locked up in a diminishing ivory tower. So if you're in a position to do so, I would implore you, please try to work with these presses to support these models. And then if an author comes to that press with a book proposal, they can publish openly without having to pay author-facing fees. And that's great if they're mandated to do so. It's also great for scholarship in general, I think, and for academic freedom. And as I've put on screen, one thing is for sure, if we want a different outcome, we need to do something different. Because if we sit back and wait to see how all this is going to pan out, these programs will fail, and we will be left with something very similar to the current unsustainable APC crisis in the journal world that is draining the system of money. So we know that libraries are strapped for cash. I know colleagues are being made redundant. It's a pretty dire picture. This is probably not the top priority for everyone right now, but I hope that those of us that can will do everything they can. So thank you for listening. Happy to take Q&A. There's my contact details, and we'll share the slides afterwards.